So why is it important to know your community?
Well, once you know your community, then you can determine how you go forward. Without that sort of platform of understanding, you can potentially want to do things that your community isn't ready for or may not be positioned to become part of. So knowing them well and knowing them at a level where you know what their expectations are, what their priorities are, then
what their needs are.
Yeah, then you can go forward.
Great. And if someone had to start right at the beginning, how would you see that? How would we help them to start?
Well, there's a variety of different ways to get to know your community, and many different patient support groups are in different positions. So some know their communities very well and others know their community not at all because they may be starting out themselves, or it may be a really small community. So finding that community can be challenging sometimes. There are different ways to get to know your community. Networking, if that's possible, it isn't always possible, it can be expensive. So attending conferences and things like that can be really expensive and not available, or it can be. That's the challenge of the diverse range of patient support groups that exist across the world. Surveys.
Yeah.
So asking questions in a survey, and there might be different kinds of surveys. Certainly in Australia we would use different kinds of surveys. So we might use a demographic type survey to work out, well, who is this community? How old are they? Where do they live? What's their socioeconomic status?
So the more details and the more awareness you have of your community, then the more empowered you'll be to be able to make the next decision that best benefits them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that demographic information might tell you that the community is a paediatric community that has a caring population in a particular age group, which could then impact on the financial ability that age group have. So there might be an age group that are seeking that really would be working if they weren't caring. So the impacts of that become important. So that's kind of that demographic piece. But it might also be that you need to know how do they feel about their lives? What's their experience of the health system? Are they well served? Are they not well served? Do they perceive that they are well served in a diagnostic sense? So maybe it's well supported to find out what's going on, but they're really poorly served from a care perspective.
Yeah. And we cannot underestimate the value of well-being and feeling validated, feeling seen, feeling cared for and important, not being made to feel invisible.
No, so if you know where your community is at with that, you then know what you need to advocate for, what you need to plan for. And surveys can be a really great tool to put you in a position where you can work with your community in the future.
It's fantastic. And being more aware is going to give you more power to make a clear decision that can lead you on a path to success. So on our website for Advocacy Beyond Borders, we do have access to some surveys. One is a demographic survey and one is a thematic survey.
Yeah, so there's some tools that are there for the Advocacy Beyond Borders community to use. The other type of survey that's really important is a survey that is being generated for a really specific or explicit purpose. So in Australia and in every country, there is some kind of regulatory process to bring medicines into the country. So in Australia, we use health technology assessment, and part of the patient voice response into a health technology assessment is what's actually happening for that patient group. What difference will a treatment make if it is suddenly available? And what happens if it's not? So that real world evidence about what's the impact of a medicine, what's the trajectory, how can it change a person's trajectory? That's also critical information that a survey can generate.
Very powerful information that can then be utilised to have influence, and maybe influence for politicians or influence for clinicians to understand more about the community that is of need.
Yeah, I remember a campaign in Australia that was used explicitly to generate evidence for an assessment for a medicine, and it was called 10 Steps, and it was all about if this medicine became available, there was scientific evidence that said that it would assist people to be able to walk or have mobility for 10 steps more than they currently have. Now, that doesn't sound very much. But what the patient voice was able to establish was that 10 steps meant that they could actually go to the bathroom by themselves, that they could go and make a cup of tea by themselves. So suddenly, the impact on quality of life, massive, massive. Now I have autonomy. Now I have self-sufficiency. Hugely important for well-being and that value, sometimes how we can think about our own value.
Yeah. So obviously this speaks to the fact that it's the smaller things that can be missed that can have a very large impact on well-being and on feeling that you have a good quality of life, and that needs to be factored in and is just as important as some of those more dramatic and obvious treatment benefits.
Yeah, and the only place you're going to get it is from the patient community.
True.
So no one else can tell that story about my life is going to change if this happens.
It's the value of that person gaining that outcome. That's something that someone else who didn't have to live through that lifestyle and those impacts on their lifestyle because of the disease would not really understand.
Absolutely. So capturing that, that's part of knowing your community.
Yeah.
And the value that you can then provide across a whole range of stakeholders. You know, I've talked about into a health technology assessment process.
Yes.
But there are other stakeholders that need to know about your community and what their life is like and how their lives could be positively impacted, like health professionals and industry.
And even researchers. I think what matters to the person and being valued and having a real voice within the realm of the carers around them, the support people around them, be it researchers, be it clinicians, be it politicians, you know, be it pharmaceutical companies, but to have an understanding of what matters, because we have the knowing of who the community are, and we understand that the strength of that community is what influences the change.
Yeah, and a really important piece of that as well is having it before it's needed. So it's often the case, and we do this all the time in Australia, that you know something is coming up, so you're in a mad scramble to go and collect the evidence. It's so important to be able to have a history of community as well. So if we can start to generate a history of community, we've got such a powerful advocacy tool that we can demonstrate over time how important a change would be.
Yeah, so having a baseline to then see the difference and the changes that have come to that community.
Yeah.
So are there any considerations or things that we should be cautious about when we're gathering information about communities?
Yeah, absolutely. With seeking personal story and personal information about community and individuals within that community comes great responsibility in collecting that information. Now, we know we're going to use it for all the right reasons, but it's very important that as part of a collection, a storage, a utilisation, how you maintain that information, that you have a plan. It's important to begin any type of survey with getting consent from who it is that you're asking for this information and being very transparent about your intentions with it. So why are you collecting it? And who's going to see it? So what's the plan for that information? Now, certainly it's generally not required at all that you would ever be sharing Jane Smith said this about themselves. More likely you're sharing information that says my community feels this, or my community is generally people aged from this within this range. So we don't need to be saying Jane Smith's having this experience.
So it's not specific information about one individual, it's anonymised, broader information generally that we would be looking at. However, there are still considerations.
Well, to get that, you've got to collect it at individual level.
Yes.
So it's that being really transparent with the community to say, yes, we're asking you. But when we tell your story, we're going to be telling your story as part of a community narrative, as part of a community story, because that's where the power is, that united voice, that's where the influence is. Your story is really important as an individual, but your story as part of a collective community voice is where the power is. So that means if you're the one who's collecting that data, you have the responsibility to protect every person that you've asked. And the way that you do that is through that consent process. And that needs to be written, and you'll find a consent statement on our survey templates, which are on our website. You'll find a statement that says this information is being collected by, insert name here, for the purposes of, insert purpose here, and you consent, or you are asking people to consent to having that individual information aggregated up into a de-identified story about your community. So that consent process and protecting the privacy of individuals.
Yeah, I think that's such an important area, because it's with the knowledge of what you're intending to do with someone's information, and that it's for a purpose that's going to make a difference to their life, and that there's limitations around that use, and privacy is respected, is very different to just having your data being taken without your knowledge or in a way that you don't agree to. And I think that really it is that intention and the transparency that you speak of that is vital.
And essentially for our communities, if you start collecting data on your community, you may have years worth. So that's not just a powerful story, it's a lot of information.
It's
about
evidence.
Yeah, and it's personally driven. So if you've got 5 years of an individual story, there's a real responsibility to treat that information with respect. And that means having strong governance around that database? How is it being stored? Who has access to that? How is it protected? And because I consented 5 years ago to sharing my data, am I still in the same position? Am I still okay with that?
And what is it used for? I think that's a key component.
And what it's used for when you collected it may be different as science evolves, as we know. Sometimes it's not even in the ballpark what we think the data is going to be used for, because it doesn't exist, and then all of a sudden it does.
Yeah.
So it's really important to be able to go back to the community and say, hey, this really innovative technology is now available.
Like AI, for example.
Yeah, are you okay if we share your aggregated story now as evidence for something that we want to change, or something that's important about a new technology being applied in the health system, for example?
Something that comes to mind as a possibility in the future would be, to help with diagnosis for GPs using aggregated data, but being able to have the conversation with your community and determine that is something that they agree to at that future point, and touching base with that community and having that regular contact around their privacy and their agreement and their consent, then enables the next step for that innovative technology to maybe offer more diagnostic success.
I think that's a perfect lead in as well to when we're talking about genetic and genomic science that is being introduced and more mainstreamed into countries around the world. How we as patient communities feel about that,
embrace it,
how we want to be, how we want to be part of that story. I think data that you've collected, that history that you've been collecting, becomes an important pillar into the planning of those things being introduced. But 10 years ago, who would have even thought about that?
So it's like a treasure trove that you may need to open, and the important thing is to, before you open the box, check in again with the community that this is okay.
Perfect. Yeah. So knowing who your community is, knowing where they're at and the environment that exists around them, what their priorities and needs are, then you are really well positioned to say, how do we harness this power and use it to its most effective end?
So Advocacy Beyond Borders has a heap of resources that can be accessed that would really help to get the ball rolling, to find out more about your community. Can you talk through what those would be?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier, Lisa, that there are templates for surveys. Yep. So there is a demographic template that helps you determine who your community is from an age, from a gender, from a socioeconomic, those kind of demographic pieces of data. From a thematic, so there's a thematic template that talks about understanding the things that are important to your community and what their lived experience is like across a range of different experiences that your community will be having. There are some examples for explicit use of data, so collecting real world data. There's some survey tools that have been generated, for example, for health technology assessment. And there's copies of those on the website. So you can use those to help you collect data which will give you evidence to be used for those regulatory purposes.
Right.
There's also a number of fact sheets. Because this is such an important area, we wanted to make sure that it's not just us talking about them, but there are things that you can go back and look at. So there's some fact sheets about privacy.
Great.
There's a fact sheet about consent. And there's a fact sheet about data and data management and responsibilities, but also how to do those things. What are some safeguards that you can put in? So that information is there and all freely available.
That sounds great. So it gives everybody a place to start, background information on each area to give a little bit more knowledge, and then real tools to start the journey of gathering vital information, depending on which part of the picture you want to focus upon.
Yeah, so you might want to have a look at those, and then when you're looking at implementation, if you think you need some more assistance, then that's the time to have a look at the Contact Us page on the website and send us a note.